this video lecture, we're looking at the entire banking system and how one additional loan at one bank can create a much larger change in the money supply. This is called multiple deposit expansion. It just means that money is deposited and then loaned and then deposited into a new bank and then loaned again, and that cycle continues. So one deposit or one loan can actually create multiple deposits in the future. We're going to look at an example here, and the example is that a $100 bill is found and deposited. So we have an initial change in money supply of $100. In this example, the reserve ratio, the required reserve ratio is 20%. The banks are all loaned up, which means that they're going to hold no excess reserves. If they get any excess reserves, they're going to immediately loan it out. In this chart, I'm going to walk you through step by step what actually happens when that $100 gets deposited and how it turns into a much greater change in money supply. But I don't want you to worry too much about this. You're not going to have to do something like what is shown in this chart. I am going to show you a shortcut on the next slide. So this is what happens when we have an initial change in the money supply. So we have a new deposit of $100 into a bank. That bank is going to hold on to the required reserves, and remember that's 20%. So they're going to hold on to 20% of it. The rest of it is $80, that's their excess reserves, and they're going to loan that out. This loan is an increase in the money supply. So now we can see how the initial increase of $100 caused another increase in the money supply of $80. And when that money gets loaned, the person that receives the loan is going to go out and spend the money. And when they spend the money will end up in someone else's bank account. So as we move to the next row, we're actually into a new bank. So this is Bank B. So Bank B now has an additional $80 in deposit at their bank. They're going to keep 20% of it. The other 80% of excess reserves, they're going to lend out. So that means we have an increase again in the money supply of $64. And this process continues over and over again through all these banks. A bank will get a new deposit, they'll hold on to 20% of it, and they're going to lend out the other 80%. And that's an additional increase in the money supply. If we went through all of the different banks and increases in their money supply, and we added up this entire column of additional loans, we would get the total change in the money supply, which is $400. This multiplication that happens between an initial change in deposits or reserves to an ultimate change in the total change in the money supply is called the monetary multiplier, or you'll sometimes see it as called the money multiplier, and that's normally what I call it. Monetary means money, so same thing. To solve for the money multiplier, you just take 1 and divide by the required reserve ratio, which that's always given to you. In the example we were just looking at, the required reserve ratio was 20%. We're going to change it into a decimal. So 1 divided by 0.2 is equal to 5. So the money multiplier in this example is 5. And the way the money multiplier works is you can look at the initial change in reserves, which we had an additional $100, multiplied by the money multiplier. So times 5 would give us $500. That's the total change in the money supply. So we can see here we had $400 additional dollars from that bank system lending and the $100 initially that was found. So that $100 initial change turned into a $500 total change in the money supply. So the formula you need to solve is right here. You're just going to take the excess reserves or the change in reserves. A lot of times they'll just tell you there's a little bit more in reserves. Like in our example, reserves went up by $100. Just multiply that by your money multiplier and you will get the change in the money supply. This is officially called the maximum checkable deposit expansion, but that means the same thing. So remember, checkable deposits is just part of our money supply. So we're just talking about the change in the money supply. So another way to write this formula is change in the money supply is equal to change in reserves times the money multiplier. Here you have your official definition of the money multiplier. It's the maximum amount of new money created by a single dollar of excess reserves. The higher the reserve ratio, the lower the money multiplier will be. And there's two more things I want you to remember about how this works. First, we talked about how making loans creates money. If loans are repaid, it destroys money. That just means that the money supply becomes smaller. The second thing you want to remember is that if banks are all loaned up and excess reserves are zero, the money multiplier works very well. So this is why we call it the maximum amount that money supply could increase. It could actually be less than the value that we're calculating. And that's if banks decide not to loan out all of their excess reserves. If banks hold on to excess reserves instead of lending them, then the money supply will be much lower. And we'll talk about this more in the next chapter. Here is an activity to try. We're looking at an individual bank's balance sheet here. The reserve ratio right now is 25%. Solve for the bank's required reserves. Solve for the maximum amount of new loans the individual bank can make. That means you're solving for excess reserves. Next, solve for the money multiplier. And finally, solve for the maximum amount the entire banking system might lend. For the last one here, you want to solve for the maximum checkable deposit expansion or solve for the change in the money supply. That's the same thing. The wording is a little different, but keep in mind here when we're looking at the maximum amount that the entire banking system can lend, that's the same thing as solving for the change in the money supply. Pause the video here and give it a shot, and then I will go over it. Step 1 is to solve for the bank's required reserves. We calculate required reserves by taking checkable deposits, which is 120,000, multiplying by the reserve ratio in decimal form, so times 0.25. That will give you $30,000. To solve for the maximum amount of new loans that the individual bank can make, we want to solve for excess reserves. Excess reserves is actual reserves. That's the amount that's listed under reserves on the balance sheet, so 50,000, minus required reserves, which we just solved for in part A. So 50,000 minus 30,000 tells us that this bank can lend out $20,000. For part C, what is the money multiplier? To solve for the money multiplier, you just take 1 divided by the reserve ratio in decimal form, which is 0.25. And that will give you a money multiplier of 4. For part D, solving for the maximum amount the entire banking system can lend, we want to solve for the change in the money supply. That is excess reserves times the money multiplier. So 20,000 times 4 gives us a total amount for the entire banking system of $80,000. And that's going to be how much the money supply can increase. This concludes this chapter about the banking system. In the next chapter, we're going to look at how the Federal Reserve can use reserves and use reserve ratio to encourage lending to promote growth.